Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Fog. The fog rolled in thick and grey over St. Mary's Hollow, draping the village in a shroud that muffled sound and softened edges. It was the kind of evening where secrets felt closer to the surface, as if the mist itself were coaxing them out. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the street below. At 74, her sight wasn't what it once was, but her mind, oh, her mind was a steel trap, polished and precise. The gas lamps flickered like hesitant stars, and the cobblestones glistened wet from an earlier rain. She'd lived in St. Mary's Hollow all her life, knew every creak of its old bones, every whisper of its gossip. Tonight, though, something felt off. A prickle ran up her spine, the kind she hadn't felt since the business with poor Mrs. Harrow's missing pearls, and that had ended in a rather nasty surprise. A shadow moved through the fog, halting beneath the lamp across the street. Miss Marple leaned forward, her needles pausing mid-stitch. It was a man, tall and angular, his coat collar turned up against the damp. He stood still for a moment, then tilted his head as if listening. She couldn't see his face, but there was something deliberate in his posture, something that made her fingers tighten around her wool. Then came the sound, a low, breathy murmur, barely audible through the glass. A woman's voice, sharp with urgency. "Elliot," it said, and the word hung in the air like a ghost before the fog swallowed it. The man flinched, his head snapping toward the alley beside the baker's shop. A second shadow emerged, smaller, cloaked in a shawl. The woman stepped. Closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Elliot, you promised!" Miss Marple's lips pursed. Promises, in her experience, were fragile things, easily made, easier broken. The man, Elliot presumably, shifted, his hands clenching at his sides. "Not here!" he snapped, his voice rough as gravel. "Tomorrow. The old mill." The woman let out a sound, half sob, half laugh. "You'll regret this." Then she turned and vanished into the mist, her footsteps fading into silence. Elliot stood there a moment longer, staring after her, before he too melted into the night. Miss Marple leaned back, her needles resuming their dance. "Elliot," she murmured to herself, tasting the name. It wasn't one she knew. Not yet. St. Mary's Hollow was small, but it had its newcomers, its drifters, and its secrets. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. 9:30. Too late for a respectable visit, but not too late for trouble. Downstairs, the kettle whistled. She set her knitting aside and rose, her slippers whispering against the floorboards. As she poured her tea, her mind churned. A name whispered in the fog, a promise unkept, a meeting at the old mill. It was a thread, thin and fragile, but Miss Marple had unravelled greater mysteries from less. She took a sip of tea, the warmth steadying her. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd pay a visit to Mrs. Finch at the post office. If anyone knew an Elliot, it'd be her. She had a nose for newcomers, and a tongue that wagged like a metronome. Yes, tomorrow would do nicely. But as she climbed into bed that night, the fog pressing thick against her window, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something darker than the mist was creeping into St. Mary's Hollow, and that whispered name Elliot was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Name on the Wind. The morning broke cold and clear. The fog of the previous night burned away by a weak April sun. Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, her hat pinned neatly atop her silver curls, a basket of scones tucked under her arm as a pretext for her visit. The post office was a short walk, but she took her time, nodding to Mr. Grayson sweeping his stoop and pausing to admire Mrs. Tully's early tulips. In a village like St. Mary's Hollow, haste was suspicious, and Miss Marple was never one to arouse suspicion. The post office smelled of ink and old paper, with a faint whiff of lavender from Mrs. Finch's perpetual sachets. The woman herself stood behind the counter, her spectacles perched on her nose, sorting letters with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. She looked up as the bell above the door jingled, her eyes narrowing with the glee of a gossip scenting fresh prey. "Jane Marple, as I live and breathe," Mrs. Finch chirped, setting a stack of envelopes aside. "What brings you out so early? Not another lost parcel, I hope." Miss Marple smiled, setting her basket on the counter. "Oh, nothing so dramatic, Edith. Just thought you might like some scones, your favourite with currants. And, well, a bit of company never hurts." Mrs. Finch's grin widened as she plucked a scone from the basket. "You're a saint, Jane, though I'll wager there's more to this than scones. You've got that look about you, same as when you sniffed out that business with the vicar's missing hymnals." Miss Marple chuckled, adjusting her gloves. "You do know me too well. Tell me, Edith, have you heard of anyone new in the village? A man, perhaps, by the name of Elliot?" Mrs. Finch paused mid-bite, her eyebrows shooting up. "Elliot, you say? Funny you should ask. There's an Elliot Grayson, nephew to old Mr. Grayson, arrived just last week. Keeps to himself mostly. Rents the cottage by the mill stream. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's expression remained placid, though her mind whirred. Elliot Grayson, nephew to the village's quietest widower. Interesting. "Oh, just something I overheard," she said airily. "A name on the wind, you might say. Did he come alone?" "Far as I know," Mrs. Finch replied, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Though there's talk he's expecting someone. A woman, they say. Saw her at the station yesterday, all bundled up like she didn't want to be seen. Didn't catch her name, but she asked for directions to the old mill." The old mill. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious." Mrs. Finch smirked. "You're up to something, Jane Marple. Don't think I don't see it. What's brewing this time?" "Nothing brewing yet," Miss Marple said, picking up her basket. "Just stirring the pot a little. Thank you, Edith. The scones are yours to keep." She stepped back into the sunlight, her mind a tangle of threads. Elliot Grayson, a newcomer with a whispered name. A woman at the station, bound for the mill. A promise, a threat, a meeting set for today. She glanced toward the mill stream, its waters glinting in the distance. The old mill loomed there, half ruined and silent, a relic of busier days. It was no place for a casual rendezvous, not unless something was meant to stay hidden. As she walked home, a breeze rustled the budding trees, carrying with it the faint echo of last night's whisper. "Elliot," Miss Marple tilted her head, listening. The wind had a way of carrying secrets, and she had a way of catching them. Tonight, she decided, she'd take a stroll by the mill. Not to interfere, of course, just to observe. After all, a little fresh air never hurt anyone. But as she turned the corner to her cottage, she caught sight of a figure hurrying down the lane. A woman, her shawl pulled tight, her steps quick and furtive. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She didn't recognize her, but something about the way she moved, the tension in her shoulders, felt familiar, like a shadow from the fog. The woman disappeared around a bend, and Miss Marple smiled to herself. "Well, well," she said softly, "the pot's beginning to simmer." Chapter 3. Shadows at the Tea Table. By afternoon, the village hummed with its usual rhythm, cartwheels clattering, children laughing, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, a tray of tea and biscuits before her, hosting an impromptu gathering she'd arranged with a few well-chosen invitations. If there was one thing she'd learned in her years of untangling mysteries, it was that people revealed more over tea than they ever did under questioning. Across from her sat Mrs. Tully, plump and rosy-cheeked, her hands fluttering as she recounted the latest gossip about the vicar's new curate. Beside her was Mr. Grayson, Elliot's uncle, a wiry man with a face like weathered oak, his pipe clenched between his teeth. And at the window, peering out with a restless air, stood young Lucy, Harrow, Mrs. Harrow's niece, who'd come to stay after her aunt's passing. Lucy was a nervous thing, all sharp angles and darting eyes, her fingers twisting the hem of her skirt. And I said to the vicar, "If that boy's sermons get any longer, we'll need cushions for the pews." Mrs. Tully finished with a laugh, reaching for a biscuit. "What do you think, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled over her teacup. "I think the vicar's lucky to have such a patient flock, though I wonder if newcomers feel the same." "Mr. Grayson, your nephew's settled in, hasn't he?" "Elliot, isn't it?" Mr. Grayson puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling upward. "Aye, Elliot. Quiet lad, keeps his own counsel. Came down from London, needed a bit of country air," he said. "London?" Mrs. Tully interjected, her eyes gleaming. "Fancy that! What's he do, then? Something grand, I'll bet." "Dunno," Mr. Grayson grunted. "Never asked. He's family. Don't need his life story." Lucy shifted by the window, her gaze flicking to Miss Marple. "I saw him yesterday," she said abruptly, her voice thin. "By the mill stream. He was talking to someone, a woman." Miss Marple's cup paused halfway to her lips. "Oh, did you recognize her, dear?" Lucy shook her head, her fingers tightening on her skirt. "No, she was too far off, but they looked angry. I didn't stay long." Mrs. Tully clucked her tongue. "Angry, you say? Well, that's a fine welcome to St. Mary's Hollow. Maybe she's one of those city types, always in a huff about something. Or someone with a purpose," Miss Marple mused, setting her cup down. "The mill's an odd place for a chat, wouldn't you say? All damp and draughty." Mr. Grayson shrugged, tapping his pipe against the saucer. "Young folk do queer things. Elliot's always been a bit solitary. Likes his corners, he does." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Lucy. The girl had turned back to the window, her posture rigid. There was something there, a flicker of unease that went beyond idle curiosity. She filed it away, like a scrap of yarn tucked into her knitting bag. The conversation drifted to safer waters. Mrs. Tully's tulips, the price of flour. But Miss Marple's mind stayed on the shadows at the table. Elliot Grayson, a solitary man from London, meeting a woman at the mill. Lucy Harrow, jumpy as a cat, watching from afar. And that whispered name, Elliot, still echoing in her ears. As the guests departed, Lucy lingered by the door, her voice low. "Miss Marple, do you ever feel like something's wrong, but you can't say why?" Miss Marple met her gaze, steady and kind. "All the time, dear. It's usually a sign I'm about to find out what." Lucy hesitated, then nodded and slipped out. Miss Marple watched her go, her thoughts turning to the old mill. Tonight she'd promised herself a stroll. Now, with Lucy's words and Mr. Grayson's reticence swirling in her mind, that promise felt more like a necessity. She glanced at the clock. 4 o'clock. Plenty of time to tidy up and plan her evening. The tea table had given her threads. Now she'd see where they led. And if the shadows grew longer by the mill, well, Miss Marple had always been fond of a challenge. Chapter 4. The Locked Room Riddle. The old mill stood hunched against the twilight, its broken wheel creaking in the breeze that swept down the mill stream. Miss Marple approached it with her usual unhurried gait, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. She'd chosen a path that wound behind the hedgerows, out of sight from the village, her lantern unlit. She preferred the cover of dusk, for now. The air carried the damp scent of moss and the faint tang of rust, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. She paused at the mill's sagging door. Its wood splintered and grey, the lock hung loose, rusted through, but the latch was shut tight. Odd, she thought. Someone had been here recently enough to secure it. She pressed her ear to the gap, listening. Nothing but the drip of water and the groan of old timbers. Yet that prickle, that instinct she trusted more than sight, told her something waited inside. With a gentle push, the door gave way, scraping against the stone floor. She stepped in, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The mill was a cavern of shadows, beams crisscrossing overhead, the floor littered with straw and broken crates. And there, slumped against the far wall beneath a boarded window, was a figure. Miss Marple's breath caught, though her face remained calm. She crossed the room, her slippers silent, and knelt beside the body. It was a woman, her shawl tangled around her shoulders, her dark hair spilling across her face. A thin line of blood trickled from her temple, staining the straw beneath her. Dead, no question. Her skin was cold, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "Poor thing," Miss Marple murmured, brushing a strand of hair from the woman's face. She didn't recognize her, not a villager then. The woman from the station, perhaps. Her hands were clenched, and in one fist a scrap of paper peeked out. Miss Marple eased it free, unfolding it with care. A single word, scrawled in a shaky hand. Elliot. Her lips pressed into a thin line. That name again, now written in death. She tucked the paper into her pocket and stood, scanning the room. The window above was nailed shut, the boards intact. The door she'd entered was the only way in or out, and it had been latched from the inside. No key, no sign of tampering. A locked room, then, with a murdered woman and a name as the only clue. Footsteps crunched outside, sharp and hurried. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, her heart steady despite the sudden tension. The door swung open, and Elliot Grayson stumbled in, his coat askew, his face pale as chalk. He froze when he saw the body, a choked sound escaping his throat. "God in heaven!" he rasped, staggering forward. "Oh, Clara, no, no, this can't." He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch. Miss Marple watched, silent, noting the tremor in his fingers, the wildness in his eyes. Grief, yes, but something else, too. Guilt? Fear? "Who's there?" he snapped, his head whipping around. His gaze landed on her, and he lurched to his feet. What are you doing here?" Miss Marple stepped into the dim light, her expression mild. "Taking an evening stroll, Mr. Grayson. I heard a noise and found this. I take it you knew her." "Knew her?" His voice cracked. She was Clara Vance, my friend, from London. We were supposed to meet here tonight." "And now she's dead," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "In a locked room, no less. How do you suppose that happened?" "I don't know," he shouted, running a hand through his hair. "I got here, and she was just someone must have—" "Someone," Miss Marple echoed, her tone gentle but probing. Yet the door was latched, the window sealed. Curious, isn't it? Elliot stared at her, his breath ragged. "You think I did this? I didn't, I couldn't." "I think nothing yet," she said, folding her hands. "But I'll fetch Constable Reed. You'd best stay here, Mr. Grayson. Running now would look rather unfortunate." He sank back against the wall, his face crumpling. Miss Marple turned and slipped out, her mind racing as she hurried toward the village. A locked room, a dead woman named Clara, and Elliot's name in her hand. The threads were knotting now, tight and tangled. But one thing was clear. The whisper in the fog had led her straight to murder. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forgotten Word. The constable's lantern cast long shadows as he and Miss Marple returned to the mill. Elliot Grayson, still, slumped where she'd left him. Constable Reed, a stout man with a perpetually furrowed brow, muttered under his breath as he examined the scene. Clara Vance's body, the latched door, the sealed window. "Damned queer business," he said, scratching his chin. "Locked, in tight, yet here she is, dead as a doornail." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice serene. "A puzzle worth solving, wouldn't you say?" Elliot lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "I told you, I didn't touch her. I got here, and she was all ready. Save it for the station, lad." Reed cut in, hauling him up. "You're coming with me till we sort this out." As the constable led Elliot away, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the mill once more. The scrap of paper with Elliot burned in her pocket, but she kept it to herself for now. Constable Reed was a good man, but he liked his answers simple, and this was anything but. She'd need more threads before she wove the full tapestry. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, a cup of tea steaming beside her, and turned her mind to Clara Vance. A London friend of Elliot's, he'd said. Yet her death felt personal, tied to St. Mary's Hollow, in ways he hadn't explained. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the past whisper to her. London. A woman with a purpose. A name clutched in a dying hand. There was history here, and history, she knew, loved to leave echoes. The next morning she paid a visit to the vicarage. The Reverend Mr. Hale, a kindly soul with a penchant for old records, greeted her with a smile. Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure? Not another lost soul needing guidance, I hope. Not lost, Reverend, she said, settling into a chair in his cluttered study. Found, rather, though no longer with us. I wondered if you might help me with a name. Clara Vance. Mr. Hale's brow creased as he adjusted his spectacles. Vance, you say? Doesn't ring a bell. New to the parish? New to the village, perhaps, Miss Marple replied. She met an unfortunate end last night at the old mill. I thought she might have ties here, family perhaps, from years past. The vicar's eyes widened. Good heavens, murder, you mean? He rose and shuffled to a shelf of leather-bound registers. Let's see. Vance, I'll check the baptismals, marriages, burials, back 20 years or so, shall we? As he pored over the pages, Miss Marple watched, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't expect Clara herself to appear. Too young, too recent. But names had a way of repeating, like ripples in a pond. After a few minutes, Mr. Hale paused, his finger tapping a line. Here's something, he said. Margaret Vance, buried 1905. Widow, lived by the mill stream. Left a daughter, Clara, born 1898. Could that be your Clara? Miss Marple's mind ticked. Perhaps not her, but a namesake. A granddaughter, maybe. Did Margaret have a son? Mr. Hale flipped a page. No sons listed, just the girl. Wait, here's a marriage. Clara Vance to a Thomas Harrow, 1916. They moved to London after. Harrow, Miss Marple repeated, her pulse quickening. As in Mrs. Harrow, late of this parish. The very same, Mr. Hale said, nodding. Poor woman passed 2 years back. Left no children, or so I thought. Miss Marple leaned forward. But she had a niece, Lucy Harrow, staying with us now. The vicar blinked. Lucy? Well, I suppose she could be a cousin, or, oh dear, this is getting complicated. Quite, Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. Thank you, Reverend. You've been most helpful. She left the vicarage, her thoughts spinning. Clara Vance, granddaughter of Margaret, daughter of the elder Clara, and Thomas Harrow. A London girl with roots in St. Mary's Hollow, and a connection to Lucy Harrow, who'd seen Elliot arguing with a woman by the mill stream. The echoes were growing louder, linking past to present, family to foe. As she walked home, she recalled Lucy's unease at the tea-table, her cryptic words. Do you ever feel like something's wrong? Yes, Miss Marple thought. Something was very wrong indeed. And Clara's death, locked in that mill, was only the beginning of the unravelling. Chapter 6. The Villain's Mask Slips. The afternoon sun hung low, casting golden streaks across the village, green as Miss Marple made her way to the Harrow cottage. Lucy had been on her mind since the vicarage, a nervous thread in the weave of this mystery. The girl knew more than she'd let on. Miss Marple could feel it, like a snag in her knitting she couldn't ignore. She knocked, and after a moment Lucy opened the door, her face pale, her eyes darting past Miss Marple, as if expecting someone else. "Oh, it's you," she said, her voice tight. "I wasn't sure. May I come in, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone warm but firm. "I think we've some things to talk about." Lucy hesitated, then stepped aside. The parlour was dim, curtains half drawn, the air heavy with the scent of lavender and dust, relics of Mrs. Harrow's time. Lucy perched on the edge of a chair, her hands twisting together. Miss Marple settled across from her, folding her shawl over her lap. "Lucy, I've been looking into Clara Vance. A name from the past tied to your family. Your aunt's sister, perhaps, or your cousin." Lucy's breath hitched, her fingers freezing. "Clara, how did you—" "The vicar's records are wonderfully thorough," Miss Marple said gently. "But I'd rather hear it from you. You saw her with Elliot by the mill stream, didn't you? The woman he argued with." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Yes, she was my cousin, Clara. I hadn't seen her in years, not since we were girls in London. She wrote me last month, said she was coming here, that she needed help." "Help with what?" Miss Marple pressed, her gaze steady. Lucy swallowed hard. She didn't say much, just that she'd done something awful, something she couldn't undo. She mentioned Elliot, said he owed her. I told her to stay away, that he wasn't worth it, but she wouldn't listen. Miss Marple tilted her head. "And when you saw them arguing, what did you hear?" "She was shouting," Lucy whispered. "Said he'd betrayed her, that he'd promised to fix everything. He kept telling her to leave, that it was too late. I ran off before it got worse." Miss Marple nodded, piecing it together. Betrayal, a promise broken. Echoes of the fog-whispered words. And last night at the mill. "I didn't go," Lucy said quickly. "I swear it. I was here alone. But when I heard this morning, Clara, dead, I knew it was him. Elliot killed her." "Did he?" Miss Marple murmured, her tone thoughtful. "The mill was locked, Lucy, latched from inside. No one came or went, except Elliot, after she was dead." Lucy frowned, confusion clouding her fear. "Then how?" "A very good question," Miss Marple said, rising. "One I intend to answer. Thank you, dear. You've been braver than you know." He left Lucy trembling in her chair and stepped into the fading light. The village was quiet, but her mind buzzed. Clara's death wasn't simple. Not a fit of rage or a lover's quarrel. A locked room demanded cunning, and Elliot, for all his distress, didn't strike her as a mastermind. Someone else's hand was at play, someone who knew the mill's secrets. She decided to visit the station next. Constable Reed would have questioned Elliot by now, and she wanted his story fresh. When she arrived, Reed was at his desk, scribbling notes. Elliot slumped in a cell across the room. "Miss Marple," Reed greeted, looking up. "Come to meddle, have you?" "Only to assist," she said with a smile. "What's Mr. Grayson?" "Told you," Reed sighed. "Claims he and Clara were partners in London. Some shady business, debts and forged papers. She came here demanding money to keep quiet. He says he refused, told her to meet him at the mill to settle it. Got there, found her dead, swears he didn't touch her." "And you believe him?" Miss Marple asked, glancing at Elliot, who stared at the floor. "Dunno," Reed admitted. "He's shaken, but that don't mean much. The locked doors. What got me stumped?" Miss Marple nodded. "May I have a word with him?" Reed shrugged. "Be my guest." She approached the cell, her voice soft. "Mr. Grayson, why did Clara write your name before she died?" Elliot's head snapped up, his eyes wide. She did. I don't know. To blame me, maybe. She hated me by the end." "Or to warn someone," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, did she ever mention Lucy Harrow?" "Lucy?" He frowned. "No, just said she had family here, someone who'd understand. I didn't ask." Miss Marple stepped back, her mind whirling. The mask was slipping. Not Elliot's, but someone else's. Clara's death tied Lucy, Elliot, and the mill together, but the how and why remained shadowed. She thanked Reed and left, the pieces shifting into place like a puzzle half solved. As she walked home, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. It carried no whispers tonight, just silence, waiting to be broken. Chapter 7. The Final Gathering. Parlour of Miss Marple's cottage glowed with the soft light of oil lamps, casting a warm sheen over the assembled faces. She'd sent notes that afternoon, polite but insistent, summoning them all. Lucy Harrow, Elliot Grayson, released on lack of evidence, much to Constable Reed's grumbling. Mr. Grayson, Mrs. Tully, and Reed himself. They sat in a loose circle, chairs borrowed from the dining room, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped, her demeanour as tranquil as a Sunday morning. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice clear. "I know it's late, but some matters can't wait. We've a puzzle to solve, Clara Vance's death, and I believe the answer's here, among us." Mrs. Tully shifted, her teacup clinking against its saucer. "A puzzle? Jane, you're not saying one of us—" "Not yet," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Let's start with facts. Clara was found dead in the old mill, a locked room, with Elliot's name in her hand. Mr. Grayson, you say she was your partner in London? A scheme gone sour?" Elliot nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes. Forged bonds, small-time stuff. She wanted out, threatened to talk unless I paid her. I told her to meet me at the mill. I was going to give her what I had left, get her off my back. And yet she died," Miss Marple said, "before you arrived. Lucy, you knew her. Your cousin, wasn't she?" Lucy flinched, her hands knotting in her lap. "Yes, she wrote me, said she was in trouble. I begged her to stay away from Elliot, but she wouldn't." Mr. Grayson puffed his pipe, his brow furrowed. "Sounds like a mess my nephew dragged home, but how'd she end up dead in a locked room?" "A fine question," Reed interjected, leaning forward. "No one in, no one out, except you, Elliot, and you swear you found her that way." "I did," Elliot snapped, his voice rising. "I don't know how—" "Patience," Miss Marple said, raising a hand. "The mill's the key. Old, neglected, but not unused. I took a closer look this morning. There's a trapdoor in the floor, hidden under straw. Leads to a cellar, then a tunnel out to the mill stream. Someone could have entered, killed Clara, and left, latching the door behind them." The room stilled, eyes widening. Reed frowned. "A tunnel? Why didn't I see that?" "It's well hidden," Miss Marple said, "but it changes things. Clara wasn't trapped. Someone planned this. Someone who knew the mill's secrets." "Mrs." Tully gasped. "You mean it wasn't Elliot?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied. "Though I wonder, Lucy, when you saw Clara and Elliot arguing, did you tell anyone?" Lucy blinked, her face paling further. I mentioned it to Mrs. Tully at the tea shop. I was upset it slipped out." Mrs. Tully nodded vigorously. "She did. Said Clara was back, stirring trouble with that Grayson boy. I told her to steer clear, family or not. That girl sounded like bad news." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Grayson, who'd gone still, his pipe forgotten. "And you, sir, did you hear of this?" He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Might have. Village talk gets around. Didn't think much of it. Elliot's business, not mine. Didn't you? Miss Marple said softly. Clara's grandmother lived by that mill stream. Your neighbour once. You'd have known the mill, its nooks and crannies, and when Lucy spoke of Clara's return, perhaps you saw a threat, not to Elliot, but to something older. Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed. What are you getting at, Jane? Clara's mother married a Harrow, Miss Marple continued, undeterred. But there's a story there. Money, land, a dispute. Margaret Vance left a will, didn't she? One that favoured her daughter over her neighbours. You, perhaps. He stiffened, smoke curling from his pipe. That's nonsense. Old history, settled years ago. Unless it wasn't, Miss Marple said. Clara came back, digging into her roots, maybe asking questions about that land, now yours. She argued with Elliot, yes, but her real danger was elsewhere. Someone who'd kill to keep the past buried. Reed stood, his chair scraping. Hold on, Mr. Grayson. You saying you knew nothing of this? I'm saying she's spinning tales, Mr. Grayson growled. I didn't touch that girl. Miss Marple smiled faintly. We'll see. The tunnel's there, Constable. Check it tomorrow. And Clara's note, Elliot, wasn't blame. It was a warning. She knew who'd come for her. The room erupted. Elliot protesting, Lucy sobbing, Mrs. Tully exclaiming. But Miss Marple stood serene, her eyes on Mr. Grayson. His mask had slipped just enough. The final word was near, and she'd whisper it soon. Chapter 8. The word that broke the silence. The parlour crackled with tension, voices overlapping as the gathered group grappled with Miss Marple's revelations. Elliot pounded a fist on his knee, insisting his innocence. Lucy wept quietly, her face buried in her hands. Mrs. Tully fanned herself, muttering about the scandal. And Mr. Grayson sat rigid, his pipe smouldering, his eyes locked on Miss Marple. Constable Reed hovered by the door, his notebook forgotten, caught between scepticism and dawning realization. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice cutting through the clamour like a bell. Enough, please. We're nearly there. One last piece, and the picture's clear. Reed crossed his arms. You've got my attention, Miss Marple. You're saying Mr. Grayson killed Clara over some old land spat. Not quite, she said, her gaze steady. It's deeper than that. Clara's death wasn't about land. It was about shame. And the name she wrote, Elliot, wasn't an accusation. It was a plea to the one person she thought might save her. Elliot frowned, his voice hoarse. Me? She hated me by the end. Why would she? Because she didn't hate you, Miss Marple interrupted gently. She feared for you, the mill, the locked room. It was staged to point at you, Elliot. But the real killer misjudged Clara's heart. Mr. Grayson snorted, leaning back. This is madness. You've no proof, Jane, just guesses and fairy tales. Proof's coming, Miss Marple said, unfazed. The tunnel, for one. Someone who knew it could have slipped in, struck Clara, and left, latching the door to frame Elliot. But there's more. Lucy, dear, tell me, when Clara wrote you, did she mention anyone else? A name from the past? Lucy lifted her tear-streaked face, blinking. She did. Said someone was after her. Someone she'd crossed in London. A woman. But she didn't say who. A woman, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes drifting to Mrs. Tully, who'd gone still, her fan frozen mid-wave. Curious, isn't it? Clara argued with Elliot. Yes, but Lucy told you, Mrs. Tully, at the tea shop. And you've a sharp ear for gossip, and a sharper memory. Mrs. Tully's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Me? Jane Marple, you've lost your wits. I'd never. You knew the mill. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. Your husband worked there years ago, before he left you for Margaret Vance's sister. A scandal buried deep, but not forgotten. Clara's grandmother took everything, land, pride, and when Clara returned asking questions, stirring old wounds, you saw a chance to settle a score. The room fell silent, all eyes on Mrs. Tully. Her rosy cheeks drained of colour, her fan clattering to the floor. That's preposterous, she stammered. I was home that night. Were you? Miss Marple said. I spoke to Mrs. Finch this morning. She saw you near the mill stream just before dark. Said you were carrying a basket. Claimed it was laundry. Odd time for washing, don't you think? Reed stepped forward, his voice gruff. Mrs. Tully, you'd best explain that. Mrs. Tully faltered, her hands trembling. Then, with a sudden lurch, she bolted for the door. Reed caught her arm, pinning her as she shrieked, Let me go! I didn't mean it wasn't supposed to. Enough, Miss Marple said, her tone final. Clara came to make amends, perhaps, to right her family's wrongs. She met Elliot to warn, him not to threaten. But you overheard, followed her to the mill, struck her with that stone I found in the tunnel. Your initials scratched on it from your gardening days. You locked the door, left her note to damn Elliot, and slipped away. Only Clara's last. Word wasn't for him, it was for you. Mrs. Tully sagged, her fight gone. She whispered it, she rasped, tears streaming, as she fell. Rose, my name. She knew. The silence broke, Elliot swearing, Lucy gasping, Mr. Grayson staring in shock. Reed tightened his grip, nodding to Miss Marple. Rose Tully, you're under arrest. I'll need that stone, Miss Marple, and a word with you later. Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course, Constable. It's in my knitting bag, safe and sound. As Reed led Mrs. Tully out, the room emptied, leaving Miss Marple alone by the fire. She picked up her needles, the click resuming its rhythm. Rose, she thought. The word that broke the silence, unmasking a villain cloaked in village cheer. The twist was bitter, but the truth always was. Chapter 9. The Dawn After the Storm. The morning after Mrs. Tully's arrest dawned crisp and bright, the village waking to a quiet, shaken by whispers of the night before. St. Mary's Hollow buzzed with the news. Rose Tully, the cheerful gossip, a murderer. But Miss Marple's cottage remained an island of calm. She sat at her kitchen table, a pot of tea steaming, her knitting resting beside a plate of untouched scones. The storm had passed, and now came the settling. A knock sounded, soft but insistent. She opened the door to find Lucy Harrow, her eyes red but steady, a shawl draped over her shoulders. Miss Marple, she said, her voice small. May I? Of course, dear, Miss Marple replied, ushering her in. Tea? Lucy nodded, sinking into a chair. I still can't believe it. Mrs. Tully, she was always so kind to me. And Clara, I should have done more. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate. You did what you could, Lucy. Clara's choices brought her here, and Mrs. Tully's bitterness sealed her fate. You're not to blame." Lucy clutched the cup, her fingers trembling. "But if I'd gone to the mill, maybe—" "Maybe's a heavy word," Miss Marple said gently. "It bends the heart without mending the past. Clara wanted to protect you, and Elliot in her way. Her last word wasn't just a name. It was a gift to unmask the truth." Lucy managed a faint smile. "You're too wise, Miss Marple. What happens now?" "You go on," Miss Marple said simply. "Live here, or return to London, whatever heals you. The village will settle in time." As Lucy sipped her tea, another knock came. This time Elliot Grayson. His coat rumpled, his face haggard but lighter than before. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Constable Reed let me go. Said there's no case against me, thanks to you." "Come in," she said, waving him to a seat. "Tea?" He shook his head, lingering by the door. "No, I won't. Stay. Just wanted to say I'm sorry. For Clara, for dragging this mess here. I thought I could outrun it." "Trouble has long legs," Miss Marple said with a wry smile. "But you didn't kill her, Elliot. That's what matters. Where will you go?" "Back to London," he said. "Start over. Clean this time. No more schemes." "Good," she said, nodding. "Clara would have liked that." He hesitated, then offered a shaky grin. "You're a marvel, you know that. Uncle says you're wasted on this village. Tell Mr. Grayson I'm quite content," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Though I'll keep an eye on him. He's not above a grumble or two." Elliot chuckled, a sound rough but real, and left with a nod. Lucy finished her tea and followed soon after, promising to visit again. The cottage fell silent, save for the tick of the clock and the rustle of leaves outside. Miss Marple took up her knitting, the needles clicking a familiar tune. The case was closed. Constable Reed had the stone, Mrs. Tully's confession, and the tunnel's proof. Rose Tully would face justice, her mask of kindness stripped away by a single whispered word. Rose. It had been vengeance, not land, that drove her. A wound festering since her husband's betrayal, reopened by Clara's return. She thought of Clara, a girl caught in her family's shadows, trying to right old wrongs. Of Elliot, flawed but spared. Of Lucy, fragile but growing stronger. The village would heal as it always did, its secrets tucked back into the quiet. As the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple rose to tend her garden, the air fresh with promise. The storm had broken, the dawn had come, and St. Mary's Hollow breathed anew. She hummed softly, a tune from her youth, and let the peace settle around her. The whisper was silent now, and that, she thought, was satisfaction enough.